A new post by Alternet makes the claim that Americans are among the poorest in the world. Now, they really believe that. That's really what they're trying to make in the post. Now, what they do is they use a study from Credit Suisse from 2015 that reported up to 50 million Americans, adult Americans, had negative health and thus numbered among the poorest 10% of the world's adults. That's right. Somehow an American sitting on welfare is now poorer than a third world peasant farmer struggling to find something to eat. And that's exactly the point that they try to make. Now, the problem with this, now I've already gone over this once before, and the LLCO did an excellent post on this as well. The problem with this idea of negative wealth is that it's completely false. Let me give you an example. If an American is in debt, thus they owe more money than they bring in, then they're in negative wealth and are thus poorer than someone who has no debt. Like, that person could make $60,000 a year, but if they have $200,000 of debt, then somehow they're poorer than a guy who makes $2 a day. I mean, that's literally how it works. That's the problem with what they're saying. They're talking about negative wealth. So I don't really know what kind of world it is you live in where someone who makes even $1,000 a month on a part-time minimum wage job is somehow as equally poor or among the 10% poorest people of the world who make only $2 a day. I mean, it's just complete nonsense. Now, here's a good line from the article. It's difficult for many Americans to admit the truth about extreme poverty in our country. Our poor citizens may not be living in a farming village where they must eat millet soup and walk a mile for water, but they have to deal with homelessness, alcoholism, mental disease, opioid addiction, stress-inducing indebtedness, and inequality, and pollution levels that are the highest in the developed world. All of that makes for rock-bottom living standards. Well, it should be obvious right away that that's not true. Now, you may say that there's drug addiction roughly equal to the levels of what you see in the third world. Yes, that's true, but there's also a complete difference between these two. Most of that is the opioid epidemic. Americans are able to get those opioids that are expensive, usually from insurance companies, etc., or maybe more dubious means to obtain them. Whereas in the third world, it's less drugs like that and more things like methamphetamines used by many farmers in Burma who have to tend to their own land during the day and then often go to a factory at night, literally working 2 jobs, 16 hours a day. And many of them now using methamphetamine to do that. So there's actually a big difference between the two. These are not comparable in any way, shape, or form. And this is pollution levels that are highest in the developed world. Yeah, the developed world, not the third world. That's not comparable to the levels of people in the third world. Say the people who suffer from birth defects as a result of depleted uranium that are used on their countries when bombing them and attacking them, or DuPont dumping massive amounts of pollution into rivers in Latin America, and this causing a great deal of birth defects and general problems with health. And this is a lot worse than it is in the United States, where someone can, for the most part, be able to go to a doctor. So this kind of thing is kind of nonsense. But this is, well, they have to deal with homelessness. Okay, there is a fair amount of homelessness inside the United States. Doesn't make you part of the 10% most poor people in the world. I mean, it's ridiculous to actually list some people in the U.S., a lot of the poor people in the U.S., as being part of the poorest 10% of the world. That is absolutely ridiculous. I have a friend who went to the Philippines, and while he was there, he got into a cab and a whole ton of children ran up. Homeless children trying to give him flowers to sell to him. Do we have that? Hordes of children trying to sell these kind of things, to sell flowers and things like that to people get into cabs? No. I mean, there's a ton more examples I could give. This idea that America's among the poorest 10% of the population of the world is an absolute lie. This is one of the most disgusting examples of liberalism that I know. I mean, we know liberals lie. And their part is to try to reform capitalism, so they will massively exaggerate in order to push that. I mean, it's just, it's insane. Now, there are pockets of third world level poverty inside the United States, but those are usually confined to Native American reservations. That hardly counts for the poorest 10% of the world. I mean, these are the exception, not the rule. Whereas the kind of mass poverty that we're talking about in the third world is the rule for the vast majority, and they suffer even greater inequality than the United States suffers. So this is just simply ridiculous. Here's another good line. This is not to underestimate the miserable conditions in many third world countries. The point is that there are different forms of impoverishment, and, of course, some similar forms. While many villagers in the developing world don't have sufficient food and water, it's equally fair to say that millions of Americans have been exposed to contaminated drinking water and live in food deserts, often in frigid climates and substandard housing and insufficient heating. Well, you can kind of see that they're not trying to understate the poverty of the third world. They're just trying to claim that they're on the same level, when that is absolutely untrue. Well, I love the point about the insufficient food and water, which is generally not what the United States suffers. Now, yes, there is a water crisis inside of Flint and other places in the U.S. Now, keep in mind that this is a result of a lack of concern over the infrastructure that exists. Infrastructure that doesn't exist in most third world countries. This bad water from bad infrastructure is the exception, not the rule. This does not in any way, shape, or form try to make Americans out to be the global poor. This is absolutely nonsense. This is self-pity on a level that's almost sickening. I mean, it's incredible. Now, even for the idea of hunger. Now, keep in mind, when they rate hunger in other countries, they rate them different than they do in the U.S. In the U.S., they ask them, did you feel like you had enough to eat? Did you feel like you didn't have enough to eat at some point during the day? Whereas in the third world, hunger is listed as, did you not have something to eat? So when they compare those rates of hunger, they're actually quite different. I mean, Americans aren't lacking from food. I mean, you can tell just by looking at them. Americans may lack proper food. They do eat a lot of processed garbage. But that does not mean that they lack food. I mean, their hunger is absolutely incomparable to hunger that is in the third world. So that's a brief rundown of, basically what the article says. There is no way that you could possibly compare the poverty in the U.S. to the poverty in the third world. First world poverty and third world poverty are completely different. There is a reason why people leave their countries to go to America to be first world poor. Our poor is like middle class in most of the third world. Okay, we don't go there to get richer. They come here to have a better life because of the tremendous wealth difference between the two countries. So you can take this first worldist garbage about how the U.S. is somehow as poor as the third world, and thus, of course, that means America needs more money, as if bombing and raping the entire planet for its resources isn't enough. Somehow they still need more. Take this with, you know what, don't take it. I was going to say take it with a grain of salt. Don't take it at all. It's complete BS, and nobody should take this seriously.
Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.